Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started for the day. I did forget to mention yesterday. You might see that there is a folder on the Google Drive for presentations. In the past conferences, we've had requests from people to maybe share slides if people have them after the fact. So if that's something that you're interested and willing to do, please either send it to myself or the CTNS info email address, and we'll get it uploaded to there. Otherwise, yeah, we'll be following the same format as yesterday. And oh, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I didn't say that, sorry. So our first presentation of the day will be from Fraser Watts, who's a visiting professor in psychology of religion at the University of Lincoln and executive secretary of the International Society of Science and Religion. Fraser's a psychologist and has been busy with the Templeton Grant on spiritual intelligence, which just wrapped up. So Fraser, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Pleased to have the opportunity to present today. And I want to talk about computational modeling of human AI. And I'm at the risk of being misunderstood about this, so I better make clear at the start what I'm up to. I'm not assuming that computers can be virtuous. It may sound as though I am, but I'm not assuming that. Excuse me. And I'm aware that most people here from the papers think that on principle, computers can't be virtuous. I'm a bit agnostic about that because the history of AI shows that various things that people have thought computers could never do, they become able to do. So I'm a bit reluctant to say never, but I'm certainly not strongly claiming that computers can be virtuous. But despite that, I think there is much to be learned in understanding human virtue from setting ourselves the challenge of doing computational modeling of it. I think computational modeling has been a really valuable theoretical tool in many areas of psychology because it forces a degree of precision in theorizing that you don't easily get in any other way. So I think it's really helpful to think through how we might set about computational modeling of virtue. It's only modeling. All science, I think, uses models, and there's been increasing recognition of that in post-positivist philosophy of science since the 1960s. And models are only models. They help us to understand things, but they don't exemplify in themselves what they are modeling. So computational modeling, like any modeling, I think is just modeling. Braden mentioned that I'm a psychologist. I am, and so I'm drawing on that kind of background, and I'm interested in what's sometimes called virtue science. And one of the things I notice in this conference is that there doesn't seem to be much interest in virtue science. I think that's a bit odd, so I want to wave a flag for the scientific study of virtue, as I think that's one of the important disciplines on which we can be drawing in this discussion of virtuous AI. So that's what I'm up to and not up to. It's also widely assumed that virtue is a character trait, and I think it's not. And I want to make that clear, and I think that comes out very clearly from the scientific study of virtue. This is assumed by almost all religious writers about virtue that it is a trait. N.T. Wright, for example, says it's like Brighton Rock. You can cut it anywhere and you find the same words written in it. I don't think it's like that. So I think this is one of the most important conclusions to come out of virtue science and something that needs to be taken into account in computational modeling of virtue. Firstly, there's a lack of situational consistency. People just don't behave in the same kind of ways in all situations. And one of the first bits of sort of path-breaking research on this that caused quite an impact 100 years ago was about lying in children. and they found there was very little connection between which children lied at home and which children lied at school. If honesty was a characterological virtue, you'd have found the same children doing the same thing in home and school, but there was actually almost no connection. So virtue is not a trait or disposition that goes across situations. And another important conclusion from virtue science is that virtue is multifaceted. I'm drawing here largely on the psychology of morality, but I think that's very relevant to virtue. So there are different aspects of moral functioning, like the values you hold, your understanding of situations, your emotional reactions to them, your emotional reactions to doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing, guilt reactions, and so on. And these just don't hang together very well. So I'm working on the assumption that the different facets of virtue are not very well correlated. And in particular, there's not a connection between virtuous values and virtuous behavior. And generally, people believe they are more virtuous than their behavior shows them to be. That's been studied mainly with altruism. A lot of people believe they're altruistic and will come to the help of people in need. But actually, if you set up a practical experiment and observe their behavior, a lot of people who believe they would do that don't actually do it. There is this inconsistency between values and behavior. People believe they're more virtuous than their behavior shows them to be. So we have to take that into account in computational modeling of virtue. How to go about computational modeling? I think methodologically it's helpful to take an in-between stage and to work with cognitive architectures in the first place. Cognitive architectures are a long-standing part of cognitive science. They're a kind of hybrid between computer science and cognitive psychology. And I think they're a useful halfway step. They're a way of getting clear in semi-computational terms the assumptions that are going to need to be made in full computational implementation. And in the work I've been doing recently on modeling spiritual practices, I've been using a particular cognitive architecture, interacting cognitive subsystems. I'm not going to talk about that in detail. Why do I use it? It's a comprehensive cognitive architecture, whereas a lot of cognitive architectures are just modeling particular aspects of human cognition. I think it's got the right level of precision. It's got an interesting evolutionary account of how cognition has evolved, and in particular, it embodies what I think is a crucial distinction between two kinds of human cognition. It's a distinction that's made by many people, but with a lack of consistent terminology, so the consistency doesn't completely come out. It's roughly what we call head and heart, conceptual cognition on the one hand, and an evolutionary older level of cognition that is intuitive and embodied. And I think that's really helpful to have an architecture that embodies that, and it bears on the fact I've been talking about, that people often believe conceptually that they're more virtuous than their behavior shows them to be. So how are we going to, how do people become virtuous? What's evolved? I think both kinds of cognition are involved. Virtue often just starts with intentions that are framed at a conceptual level. And they quite often come out of a religious tradition, though they don't have to. And it's, I think, a crucial defining feature of virtuous behavior that it's identified as virtuous by the people concerned. animals do things that are beneficial to other animals, but I don't think animals are virtuous because they're not intentionally virtuous and they don't identify what they're doing as virtuous in the way that humans can with their conceptual cognition. But conceptual cognition is not enough because it can just float at a different level from actual behavior. So there needs to be a long, slow process, I think, of transferring conceptually framed virtuous intentions into the ways of making sense of things that operate at a more intuitive and embodied level. And that is, as I say, a long, slow process. It happens through many specific experiences. It's what people in the Catholic tradition have sometimes called education of conscience. Another last point to make before I close, virtue is crucially relational. We're virtuous in relation to other people, not just sort of on our own. So if we're going to do computational modeling of virtue, we're going to have some kind of relational intelligence. And this is a deficiency in computer science, as many people have pointed out. AI largely works with individualistic assumptions and has not made much effort so far to model relational intelligence. There have been some efforts in this direction, and my project colleague, William Cloxin, has made, I think, a significant effort in that direction. But I'm just noting that virtue is inherently relational, and this is a problem that's going to have to be cracked before we can make any significant progress at all towards the computational modeling of virtue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fraser. Jilu Louis?
Hi, it's actually Liu, Jilu Liu.
Oh, my apologies.
Okay. So Fraser, I'm very interested in your project because I'm doing virtual ethics, and it's great to see psychologists taking on some constructive cognitive architecture. That's what I aim to learn. But I think that what psychologists mean by virtue is not quite the same as what at least virtue ethicists mean by virtue, because for most of virtue ethicists, the cultivation of virtue is a process. So if you cite children, we wouldn't say that children have the virtue of honesty, okay? But we would say that someone who has really become, mature, morally mature, and then that person it will not waver with the situation of pressure. I'm sure you've read John Doerr's Out of Character, and he cites many experiments to support situationism. But you know that in all of these experiments, they all show that majority of subjects would do this and that under the situational pressure. But so virtue ethicists are interested in the minority who would not, because those are the people who have cultivated the globalist virtue or the ingrained virtue and a robust virtue. So that's what we are looking for. And the form of virtue ethics is, in particular, is the kind of a moral exemplary. And we're looking at the people like the saints, like the Confucian sages. These are the people who would never do anything wrong under any situation, because they have been, you can say they have been habituated, or they have cultivated themselves to that level of moral maturity. So I think that you cannot define virtue simply as what you see in psychology. Thank you.
Okay, I'd largely take that point and take the point that it takes some years before children can be said to be virtuous. And I mean, I was emphasizing that you need a conceptually framed intention to become virtuous, and you need to sort of identify your behavior as virtuous. And very young children wouldn't be conceptualizing things in that way. And I take the point that not all moral behavior is virtue, and moral behavior may be more situationally specific than virtue. But I'm not aware of any good empirical literature on situational specificity in virtue. There may be that literature, but I'm not aware of it. I think it's largely a theoretical assumption. And I suspect that even saints and sages are a bit less consistent in their virtuous behavior than is often claimed for them. But it's an empirical matter.
Marius?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask actually a similar question, so I will not do that. But just a follow up on the observation made by Yelu. Am I right with pronunciation of your name? So virtue, the way it is understood in virtue theory, again, it disposes an agent, but it doesn't force or necessitate a good behavior, right? So even a virtuous person in many situations may actually not act according to a virtue that one possesses because of the difficulty of circumstances, which does not mean that I do not possess virtue. But I think you have answered actually to this question in one way or the other, and it's interesting to see a different perspective coming from psychologists, and I enjoyed your paper very much.
Thank you. I wonder quite what is meant by this phraseology of possessing virtue. I mean, quite what that amounts to. And I think it tends to fragment, into either virtuous intentions, dispositions, or virtuous conduct. But I'm just repeating myself, really.
Thanks. So I was thinking, I really enjoyed that. And I was thinking, though, while you were engaging the idea of relationality in virtue to what's going on in social robotics and social AI conversations. And it reminded me of an event I was at where Selma Sabanovich was showing some images of like robots of the future or whatever, domestic robots and so forth. And there were never any people in them. It was like a house layout with some robots, right? And her point was that like, this is not actually the use content of any actual machines. There should be people in there, right? And the relationality of that. So I was just sort of wondering if maybe a kind of a judicious move into kind of social robotics and social AI, there might be some cool intersections with how you're thinking about the development of virtue, especially if we think about it in spaces that are like riddled with AI in one way, shape, or form. And then with regard to the development of virtue in people and machines alike.
Yes. So it's important if we're going to have relational intelligence, relational artificial intelligence, that the computer has a kind of a model of the person they're interacting with and can modulate their behavior in relation to that. And I think some of the most interesting work in that direction has been on developing automated companions. I'm thinking of the work of my project colleague, recently deceased Yorick Wilkes, who worked on developing automated companions for the elderly. And I think he didn't achieve all that he wanted to achieve, but the dream was of having a computer that would, in principle, get to know everything about the person they were a companion to, could support their memory, could engage in conversation with them, have a very sophisticated model of the other person. That would be real relational intelligence. And if we make more headway in that direction, I mean, if AI people can, I'm not one of them, then that would be a genuine relational intelligence, I think, and it would enrich social robotics.
Yeah, thank you very much for the paper. I think the reaction that I had at points tells me that you're probably onto something there that I need to wrestle with. But I think, to keep things brief for now, I think I want to focus on one question. On page 4, you talk about moral values and moral behavior don't hang together well at all. And I was wondering, can we actually experimentally work on this because, for instance, autonomous vehicle, you can put somebody in a simulation and they're going to drive like they hopefully would while they're on the road. But if you put people in a simulation of various experiences, are they really going to act as they would in real life? Because it's not real life and they don't necessarily see the same consequences. It can be seen as a game. So I'm wondering experimentally, how do we really get at that?
Okay, so the majority of the work in this area has been on helping behavior. And yes, I mean, I completely take the point. If you set up artificial laboratory situations, you don't get at what people will do in real life. So people have been quite ingenious in sort of staging crisis events sort of in the public space outside the laboratory to see how people react to them. And that's the line of evidence goes back now about 50 years, showing that there's not much connection between people's belief in the importance of helping behavior and their actual display of it in this kind of crisis situation in the public space. I think there's a question from Hamid.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. You believe computational modeling of virtue, and you believe it is possible, and you try to present an example of such modeling in your paper, in your article. On the other hand, you say that you are agnostic about the virtual AI. I want to know if the virtue is capable of computational modeling. What prevents us from having virtual AI? In other words, what else is needed beside the computational model to have a virtual AI?
So as I say, I'm agnostic about how far we can go in this direction, and I'm interested in cognitive computational modeling of AI because I think it's a useful theoretical contribution to virtue science. Whether or not we achieve virtuous AI or not, whether or not computers become virtue, I think it's a helpful contribution to virtue science. So that's what I'm confident about. And how far we can get, I mean, I think it's difficult to make predictions about where AI might get to in some decades' time. And I've talked about the importance of relational intelligence. I mean, if a robot was going to have genuine virtue, it would need to have more sophisticated relational intelligence than it has now. But I don't think that's necessarily impossible. It's a tough challenge for AI, but I mean, I don't want to definitely claim we can do that, but I don't want to rule it out either. So I'm prepared to just be empirical about that and to see how far we can get. And I think that's often the stance that scientists take, or wise to take, not to make dogmatic claims about what science can or can't do, but just to sort of take the next steps and see where they lead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fraser. I join most of your assumptions regarding the virtuous AI and all this. Yeah, it's I can definitely second you. My question is would you use neuroscience in your cognitive modeling? Because I would see here a lot of opportunity to use results of neuroscience, mainly the neuroscience of altruism. There's lots of research done out there, and I have a couple of references if you want. I met with some professors who are working in medical schools doing this kind of research. If you are interested, we could collaborate on this, because I think neuroscience have the key on explaining many of the cognitive models and then how decisions finally are made. I'm not asserting that moral decision virtues, it's only in the brain, that's for sure, but it is a way for us to map it, if you want, because it is something we can measure, you know, and then what you can measure, you can model, because that's a little bit the problem in modeling. If you can't model, you can't measure it, you can't model it. But if you can measure it, you can model it. So neuroscience, I think here it's an interesting path. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. Neuroscience is an interesting and valuable dialogue partner in this. I think there are different views about how quickly to bring in neuropsychological modeling, and I think to sort of to go too quickly to brain models can be a distraction from doing good computational modeling. But what I'm fairly clear about is that doing some cognitive modeling that takes neuroscience into account and keeps an eye on the computational possibilities, that's a good place to start. And then you can have an exchange between these different disciplines. I think if you go too quickly into neuroscience or too quickly into programming, then you sort of lose touch with what needs to be actually modeled. Yeah, but
to use like a control, an alternative way to validate the model based only on cognitive model, computational cognitive. I think this is very good as a way to validate, you know, and to make reliable eventually.
Indeed, I agree with that. Eduardo.
Thank you very much, Fraser, for your paper. The question is, you emphasized that humans are relational beings, but at the same time, we are unintentionally able to manipulate people by being relational beings. So isn't there a danger for social robots to manipulate people unintentionally too?
Yes, there is. So relational intelligence isn't all good. I mean, it's a capacity. It can be used for good or evil, I think, in humans. And if robots had relational intelligence, they could use it for good or evil as well. I mean, I think this is the kind of message that for me comes out of Genesis 3, really, that people get this particular kind of knowledge. In the story, it's knowledge of good and evil. And I think that enables humans to do good more deliberately than other species, to do evil more deliberately than other species. So I think cognitive capacities can go either way in moral terms.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Fraser.
Pleasure.
Our next presentation is a co-authored piece, presentation by Anne Gerdes and Peter Øhrstrøm. And is a professor of information science at the Department of Media, Design and Education and Cognition at the University of Southern Denmark, and head of the Humanities PhD School's research training program in design, IT, and communication. And Peter is professor of information science at the Department of Communication and Psychology at Aalborg University in Denmark. Both of them have worked on artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence ethics.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for organizing. I really enjoyed the presentations yesterday. And Fraser, thank you for a very excellent presentation, and especially for stressing that virtues are inherently relational. And we are going to present, or I'm going to present our paper, Reconsidering Kierkegaard's thoughts on the possibility of artificial preachers and the need for virtuous priests. First, I will take you to an argument concerning the feasibility of machine morality. I'm not so agnostic. I actually think or believe that AI is incapable of exercising moral excellence. And then I'll follow up by some remarks on Søren Kierkegaard, who actually also had an idea concerning how to produce an artificial preachers, but he ended up rejecting that. And finally, just briefly, I'll introduce Arthur Prior, the father of chance logic, and that is to illustrate issues on formalization of AI, which might facilitate ethical reasoning. So I believe that AI is not capable, or we believe that AI is not capable of virtue or can cultivate virtues distinct from ours. The second point is typically made by people who believe in artificial general intelligence, and they also fear that it might end up being a species distinct from us with different values. But the idea confuses, the idea that AI can become moral or virtuous confuses consciousness with information processing and ethics with calculation, so far at least. And also the idea rests on the assumption that intelligence is something that only occurs inside our brain, but to be capable of virtues required embodied being and cultural embeddedness. And also, this is also stressed by Aristotle, it is by taking part in transactions with our fellow men that some of us become just and others unjust, by acting in dangerous situations and forming a habit of fear or confidence that we become curious or cowardly. In a word, our moral dispositions are formed as a result of the corresponding activities. So also Aristotle defines phronesis as practical wisdom combined by knowledge and experience that allow us to identify what is morally relevant in a concrete situation. So ethical virtues are not simply practice-based virtues that are acquired through life experience. Ethical virtues also require theoretical reflection. And then phronesis is a particular form of intellectual virtue that is interwoven with ethical virtues to such an extent that it is conceived as superior ethical virtue. So also footnotes that the man who is wise does not merely know how to do good things, but also want to do them. And this resonates actually well with what Putnam said already 58 years ago concerning computers, that a computer doesn't act because it wants to. And in characterizing the virtuous person, McIntyre also points to that we become independent practical reasoners, and we develop practical wisdom through being in communities of practice, through learning from shared narratives. And he emphasizes in dependent rational animals why human beings need the virtues, that our dependence on each other and our bodily and psychological vulnerability at different life stages, they can be essential for developing the kind of independence necessary for human flourishing. That means that the virtues of independent rational agency rest on the virtues of acknowledged dependence. I don't see that coming in a computer. So it is highly doubtful that an AI shall ever be capable of experiencing moral life, as an AI cannot experience what it means to be in an ethical situation in which something is at stake. This we also discussed yesterday when we talked about care robots, that they invite to risk-free relationships. So quoting McDermott, there's nothing particularly ethical about adding up utilities or weighing pros and cons until the decision maker feels the urge not to follow the ethical course of action it arrives at. So virtues require that we recognize the other and understand our mutual dependence. But this argument clearly does not rule out the opportunity to formalize morality in AI in a functional sense in AI systems. And that's funny to note that already Kierkegaard thought of this in critiquing the priests of his times. He says that despite the fact that generally speaking, I hate machines, I could really wish that someone would invent a kind of machine that could be wound up to deliver these charming and uplifting sermons. Then every congregation could acquire a machine of this sort. Then people would at least not be confronted with the offensive situation in which the priest does not do what he himself says. There would be nothing offensive about it. And he continues, it would be amusing to hear music box says, even if everyone fell by the wayside, I would be faithful to Christianity, the general doctrine, the consolation and cure for all sorrow that gives joys their true savor. It is my innermost conviction that, etc. And perhaps it would be more than amusing, because it is possible that in this way, people could be brought to pay attention to what preaching is, by hearing that preaching in the manner deemed acceptable nowadays could also be done by a music box. And this also mirrors some of the discussions we have nowadays concerning ChatGPT. But in Kierkegaard's perspective, nonetheless, the main problem in making a real preacher who could serve as a moral guide in life is that such an ethical guide requires a good personality and not just spoken words, and a personal and religious confession from a machine would simply not be credible in his eyes. But given the prevalent preaching standard during his time, Kierkegaard would probably have accepted a sermon written by ChatGPT, just as he accepted the sermons held by the music box he had in mind. But he found that the priest, to become a good ethical guide, should go beyond what could be done with a music box and also beyond what can be computed. And he even had ideas concerning what is not computational, not computational tractable. So he notes that in our time, it is the natural sciences which are especially dangerous. Physiology will ultimately extend itself to the point of embracing ethics. There are already sufficient clues of a new endeavor to treat ethics as physics, whereby all of ethics becomes illusory, and ethics is treated statistically by averages or as calculated as one calculates vibrations in laws of nature. So clearly, in that sense, we argue that full machine morality is not feasible, but you could still see it as functional morality, where you could make use of AI systems to guide ethical reasoning. And this has already also been done in machine ethics. And we would like to give some notes on the feasibility of the ontic tense logical approach to modeling aspects of ethical reasoning. And here we rely on Prior, the father of tense logic, who also started building a deontic logic, but never fulfilled that. So there's plenty of work to do in the area. And in Prior's sense, to make a complete AI, full-scale functional morality, one would have to develop a deontic tense logic that includes a complete description of the actual situation and also the relevant general moral rules. And Prior notes clearly that our true present obligation could be automatically inferred from A and B if complete knowledge of these were ever attainable. And this is, of course, highly unrealistic that that could be the case, but still in limited cases, concentrating on selected aspects of moral reasoning, one can incorporate formal models of moral reasoning and add features that allowed for ethical decision making within restricted domains. And in that sense, AI could provide useful ethical guidance in deliberations, or assist us when we are faced with very complex dilemmas. For instance, e-learning systems designed to facilitate ethical training and awareness of ethical principles, and also to illustrate various complex ethical dilemmas. And also we see a similar strategy reflected in game-like systems that are designed to facilitate users' comprehension of what is implied in ethically in, for instance, an utilitarian understanding of ethics. So in that sense, AI could be helpful. But to conclude, AI has the potential to aid in ethical reasoning and decision making in the shape of functional morality. It is unlikely that it will ever possess virtues because fundamental aspects of human ethical judgments are presumably not computational tractable. This may, of course, depend on the kind of computers and the type of formalization and implementation we will have available in the future. But it is still conceivable that there are certain human capacities that are so hard to formalize that they cannot be implemented on any computer. So if Kierkegaard is right, the pure impression of the ethical is one of them, and therefore the burden of proof rests on anyone who disagrees with this association. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, for this very engaging paper. You make strong claims, so this will immediately raise probably some reactions. I have one comment and one question. The comment is about the analogy, well, the very easy transition from the music box to ChatGPT, which I think borders some sort of logical fallacy. I'm not saying it makes it, but I'm just saying that, well, if you look at ChatGPT and you say it's just a music box, well, then of course a music box cannot do many things, but still ChatGPT is not a music box. It does certain things. So on that logic, you could go from in very small increments, and you could postulate that machines could never do stuff. And that's a little bit like Zeno's paradox with Achilles, who cannot overtake the tortoise, which in reality is not really the case. So I wonder whether you think that's the case. And the second question is about your last claim, which is that the burden of proof is on people who think otherwise. Which I wonder whether you only talk about von Neumann architecture when you talk about potentially virtuous or impossibly virtuous machines, because the devil's advocate would say that, well, humans are, after all, just biological machines. I don't subscribe to that vision necessarily, but I'm just saying that there's quite a compelling argument that humans are also machines and they are capable of virtue. So in a sense, it could be reversed to say that the burden of proof is for people who claim that humans are something more than just machines. And what is that something more that makes them capable of virtue? So yeah, that's really what I'm curious what you think about.
Thank you very much, Marius. And also for pointing out, I was not trying to make the analogy by ChatGPT and the music box per se, but I think that the ideas Kierkegaard had resonates very well with what we see now in ChatGPT. So it's not to say that because he said a music box cannot do that, then ChatGPT cannot do similar things and stuff like that. So, but I take your point in that. And also on, yeah, you could twist it and say that, well, point the gun at me and say, well, what is it you say that humans have that machines don't have? And actually, I would say that going back to the early Chalmers with when he distinguished between the easy problem and the hard problem about consciousness is to explaining why it is that even though if you see me as a machine, you cannot explain why I have certain feelings, qualia, when I experience some things. And then you can say qualia is still also just chemical stuff in my brain, but I don't buy into that, because then we go back to the discussion about a person who has never felt pain but know everything there is to know about pain can still understand what it is to feel pain. So that is what I would say that distinguishes us from machines in the first place. And I would also say that I put the point strong here because I'm so tired of, or we are so tired of all the hype surrounding AI, so that it almost become magic, and it get the hype so much that people think that AI can actually do more than it can. So this is also an argument for boosting the idea. No, let's wait. Let's just pause it a little and see that perhaps it cannot do as much now. I mean, ChatGPT cannot do anything actually.
Yeah, thank you. I doubt that music boxes can produce profound music, but what you say or said is music to my ears. I agree with you about phenomenal consciousness, subjective awareness, the 100%. Now, when you talk to people in AI who are extremely, as I know you have, optimistic about the future and this challenge, they always turn to correlates of phenomenal consciousness, which does indeed include qualia. From a scientific point of view, they actually never provide a formalization of what it is. And so I'm just amplifying, I think, or amplifying and resoundingly agreeing with what you've said. We never get a third person formal scheme for what it is. Now, there's never been a single case in the history of science and engineering where you can do something rigorously without a formalization, right? In the case of cognitive modeling, the cognitive architecture, which we heard about a short while ago, provides a lot of that structure and a lot of that formalization. There are a lot of competing cognitive architectures. They make different decisions about what can be formalized and how to do it. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. However, my question to you is, do you agree that the structure of a virtuous agent through time the structure of that agent producing all of the behaviors that we would associate with a truly virtuous agent in the human case can be produced by AI. That's different, right? So the structure, the form, and the behavior, as opposed to actually there being under the hood phenomenal consciousness. Do you think that's impossible as well?
No, I don't think that's impossible. Actually, I think that will happen eventually, because what they will do in reinforcement, they will simply try, like Stuart Russell has suggested, to learn a system values in a flow, learning from human behavior, like we discussed yesterday's, and so they will have it behavior. It could be spoken. It will obviously be difficult to make a robot. We don't have robots that walk around that long based because of battery lifetime, for instance. There are lots of things people forget, technical stuff they forget when they discuss artificial intelligence. But here I would say that we could have, you could probably tweak ChatGPT to become virtuous. Perhaps you could. But then again, there are also a lot of bias that with the best intentions and the best bias mitigation tools, there could still emerge bias and bad behavior. So it will be a huge challenge. But I think it would be computational tractable, but it would just be like kind of trial and error, and we do this, that happens, you know. So there would be no, unless you scaffold it with some formal logic on top of it, it would be hard to do anything to validate it besides tweaking it every time it goes wrong. Yeah.
Thank you. Agree 100%. Thanks.
So I'm not sure who's on now. Maybe it's Hans.
Okay, we're not hearing hands, so I'll go. Well, we sort that out. A delightful paper. Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether or not I disagree with you about the possibilities of virtuous AI, and I think I detected a wobble between your saying it was just impossible in principle, or whether you were saying it's highly improbable. If you're just saying highly improbable, then you're probably right, and I've got no reason for arguing with you. But if you think you've got a watertight argument for why in principle it's impossible, I didn't quite hear it. So little uncertainty there. And the other thing quickly, the Kierkegaard material is fascinating, and I just didn't know that, so intrigued by that. And I can imagine that there are some people who might prefer listening to a computational preacher than a real one. I mean, it wouldn't have holiness and wisdom, but on the other hand, one of the things people object to about human preachers is the hypocrisy, and an automated preacher wouldn't have that. So some people might actually prefer it.
Yes, exactly. That was also Kierkegaard's point, his main point, criticizing priests, that if we had a machine, that might be preferable in that case. Yes, you're actually right. And it was, we do say in the paper, presumably it's not computational tractable. And it's also a standpoint to take, because these days there is so much hype surrounding AI. And like a couple of years ago, DeepMind published a paper, reward is enough. So arguing that reinforcement learning would be enough to do a fully fledged artificial intelligence. And so it's kind of to bolster against that kind of argument. So, but I would say computational tractable.
Yes, if that's all you're saying, I'm fine with it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Okay,
Hans, let's see if you got it working now.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was wondering a bit about the implications if AI can be virtuous or can even be ethical. Like, can we still use algorithms for decisions in healthcare, in the prison system, in the legal system, or will that have to go out as we are using it now? Could you still briefly reflect on the implications of your argument?
So so you're asking if AI cannot be ethical or virtuous, can we use it in healthcare, for instance?
Yeah, can we continue doing that as we're doing now?
Yeah, sure, because there's no, so when you talk about AI in healthcare, you of course also talk about ethical values, and then you try to proactively embed them into system development. And this is really not so much about ethics as about hard work. So for instance, having a data-centric approach, you will very carefully curate your data to make sure that the model provide the results and the outcomes that you needed to provide. And bias mitigations tools are all over the place. So I think sometimes people confuses what is going on in machine ethics, where you try to formalize normative theories, with actually what is going on when you address values and ethics in computer science and machine learning. For instance, fair machine learning is a whole field. So a computer does not have to be virtuous to do a good job in healthcare.
A brief follow-up, if I may, but can it still make like decisions, like ethical decisions, which is happening now, especially in the legal and the prison system, like when is someone up for parole, or when is someone's case has to be reviewed or not? Can it still be allowed in those areas?
Yes, it is allowed now, and now you're probably referring to the algorithm biased towards Black people in parole releases, and the case is that these systems now are not making decisions totally on their own, but typically assist humans in decision-making processes. And of course, clearly they should not do that if they are biased, and you should mitigate these biases and hopefully proactively try to avoid them in the first place. And otherwise you should not use them until you have fixed the problem, so to speak. So yeah, I think you can use it, but most of this boils down to that often people implement these systems without proper rigorous investigations of if they work or not, because that takes time. That's time consuming.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful paper. I'm not going to come on to the camera. As you're aware from our discussion yesterday as well, that I'm very sympathetic to what you're discussing there, and very much in broad agreement with you, especially on the problem which you highlighted from Kierkegaard, the naturalization of ethics and its reduction to mathematics and physics. I think that's highly problematic. But I mean, what I was talking about yesterday, or what's in my paper, is the idea that the latest systems. I think this is very important because, as far as I can tell, the most recent work. So I'd like to offer some things to sharpen your insights there and bring it up to sort of refresh it in terms of where the latest developments. But for example, the Stuart Russell quote only extends is from a 2015 paper, whereas transform models, these are developments which foundation models and so on. These are developments which really came about from 2017, 2018. So I mean, all of that, a lot of that, and then Wendell Wallach, of course, is pre-deep learning as well. So the point here is that when you're coming to this question of computational feasibility, the sort of conceit which is going around AI development at the moment and its sort of integration into science and the social sphere is that computational feasibility, you can sort of disregard that as long as you once you have enough data, you can get a system which sort of learns the pure impression of the particular domain. So, for example, ChatGPT, the conceit is that it has learned the pure impression of the domain of language, or if it's images, it's learned the pure impression of aesthetics or whatever. So here again, this sort of the situation now is that with the as it sort of this as it increasingly is used in this sort of in gathering ethical data, or so-called ethical data. This is obviously highly problematic in and of itself. But that process of gathering that type of data, and the developments, surrounding developments. For example, I'd highlight, for example, AlphaFold. That's another thing which was, for a long time deemed to be computationally intractable. But so AlphaFold is a particular case which if I have an extension to what I'm talking about, I can discuss that a bit. But here, what I'm talking about is that computational intractability and formalization are no longer necessary. And the current tools, they make it possible to argue that they do capture the domain in a high dimensional space, abstract space. So obviously that again comes to your final point as well, that the burden of proof, where does that rest on? Because something like virtue, I mean, it's I don't think either side is privileged in terms of saying that they're the ones who have the exclusive access, unless you bring sort of other bring in the religious discourse and so on. But yeah, so I think that's the main problematization that I'd like to bring to you, this notion that formalization and computational tractability can just be jettisoned by the new methods.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that point up. And I agree with you, because as we stand now, the point is that you can show that because we have so many data, you don't have to care about formalization. It will go by itself. And they have overcome a lot of problems by using algorithms developed for gaming to fold AlphaFold, for instance. That's also gaming algorithm, abstractly speaking. But the main problem is actually that we have all this. We cannot verify what they're doing, and we cannot validate it, and you can never. And there is a huge issue about AI safety. So if you don't combine, which I also think is a trend in AI, if you don't try to combine like these bottom-up approaches with some symbolic logical formalization, then you will run into trouble. I mean, ChatGPT can do a lot of things, but I would not implement it in an enterprise as it stands, because I'm not sure if it's safe enough. And so there has been in low critical domains, low risk domains. Obviously, you can see a lot of things going on that do a fine job. But if you have to move that into critical domains, then all the hard work starts. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. If I may just add to that, I mean that's really the problem, though. That how would you demonstrate that a non-technological, non-AI approach is also that you have the verifiable standard of ethics? I mean, how would you do that otherwise anyway? I mean, if I bring an Islamic perspective into this, then it's easy to answer this question. But I mean, if you're not outside of a religious discussion, or from a philosophical or scientific perspective, or an epistemological perspective, how are you going to say that you have the verifiable proof of that your ethical judgment is the correctly verified one, and their one is not? I mean, how would you do that?
From a general perspective, I would say that if you have logic, then you can verify a system logic.
So
but
what you're saying is that ethics is reducible to logic, to logical principles.
I'm not saying, yes, I would say that you can make machine ethics in restricted domains. You can formalize some components of ethics and in restricted domains and use that. But I will not say that ethics per se is reducible to logic, but you can still use logic as a tool to formalize ethical models.
No, I'll end there, but thank you very much. I'm, as I mentioned, I'm in broad agreement, and yeah, even on this these last bits as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is open up to general conversation as well, so we can bring connections between papers or ask questions about the other previous papers as well. Marius?
Thank you. I would like to just thank Selmer for this last comment, because the difference between computable and uncomputable functions, I think, introduces a very useful framework in which to think about the things. We are halfway through the conference now, so I was a bit worried that it's very easy for us to agree with each other, and I find this a lot. People tell each other, this is music to my ears, well, emotional, positive emotions could contribute to judging some things as more coherent than others. So I'm just trying to think with the mind of someone who, which is impossible actually, but just try to imagine what somebody who does not share these assumptions that we take for granted about humans that are obvious in some of theological anthropologies that many people here share, what would they say? This is why I asked the question about what about the human as machine paradigm, which I think it was still not completely answered. And Anne was pointing towards Chalmers and the hard problem of consciousness, which I think if you go there, well, of course, that actually points to the real problem that we do not know why humans are the way they are, why consciousness emerges in the first place from inert matter. Or so according to that, we should be agnostic about whether machines could ever acquire it. And the fact that current algorithms are hyped up in an exaggerated way, and they don't do the things that they claim to be doing, or that they couldn't ever achieve the things that they want, that they claim they are capable of, I don't think that warrants very definitive conclusions about the possibilities of artificial life and artificial intelligence in general. So that's why if we identify non-computable functions, at least you could say that those things cannot be achieved via the current architectures. And I think this is a conclusion that is narrow enough to be watertight. Whereas if you're thinking about other ways of, I mean, it's actually impossible to think of what other ways of doing artificial intelligence could be out there. But I imagine that in 20, 30 years, we might look back and think, well, these things were not easy to predict, but here they are. So so I would like to keep it a little bit open, or at least if we are making an argument that because humans are like this and machines are like this, machines will never be like humans, I think we have to be a little bit more specific about what that specific human thing is. And for the first time when I heard non-computable functions, I thought, okay, this is a promising avenue to start thinking about it. Sorry for the long comment.
Yes, a related point that came to me during some of the talks, I hope you can hear me, is like, can't there be like something like moral virtue without consciousness? You can't have emotions, maybe you can't have beliefs, or maybe you can, but you can't have behavior. And why can't that not suffice for moral virtue? At least on some accounts of virtue. Why would that not be possible? It's an open question, I don't know.
Well, Anne left, but I think she would say it is possible. I think she left. I'm not. Oh no, she's back. I heard her say, or maybe she never left because I'm blind. Let's hear what she. I think I heard her say that would be theoretically possible on her scheme. But
yeah. So my comments is kind of follow up on Selmer's remark about how doing a survey on humans' opinion is not maybe it's not scientific. I think that it depends on how you perform the survey. I don't use undergraduate students, so my subjects were social groups, and many of them. So, for example, one of the topic was about robot-assisted suicide, and many of the people who answered the survey would report to me later on that some of them could not complete the survey because it was too emotional for them, and some of them think about their parents, they think about themselves, and so they are really well thought out answers, and to them, each scenario was a struggle to continue. And so that's why I only gathered over 1,000 results. But I think that from the result, it does show how mixed people's opinions are in different scenarios. And I think that shows that people's, especially when it comes to moral dilemmas or these kind of morally charged situations, people's judgment are not computational. It's very, I'm a believer of ethical sentimentalism or moral sentimentalism. And I agree with Jonathan Haidt that most of the time people's moral decisions are based on the kind of emotional and impulsive reaction at the time. And their rationalizations are often done post-factual. And so I don't think that a machine with the computational process could really match the way humans make these moral decisions in these morally charged situations. And I think that Fraser in his paper talked about two forms of human thinking. One is a kind of procedural cognitive, the other one is more the impulsive. And that's the aspect that just using the current algorithm, we cannot capture, we cannot reflect. But if we do enough of these human survey and see how people react emotionally in this situation, then we can probably bring the result back to the training. And maybe the machine can learn to be a bit less predictable and more, at least come up with more diverse answers. And I think that especially with the more dilemma situation, there's not a one set correct answer. And you have to allow moral pluralism there. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was making an argument from analogy. If we know anything in cognitive science by virtue of empirical experiments through Piaget to today, it is that human beings without sustained training, sufficient aptitude, simply cannot reason rigorously. All of the experiments show this. If you don't think you need reasoning that's absent in the general population for justifying moral judgments, then yes, you could say it's system 2 and intuitive, and that's fine. And I respect that. But if you're like me, you want a rational basis for every such judgment to be in conformity with the standards of formal logic and mathematics, then you would be very worried about using experiments as a guide. This would not only apply to what you've done, it would apply as well to Fraser. You would, if you ask for a justification of, why did you do that? Why did you just lie? Why did you not lie? Why do you think not lying is important? Humans can't articulate arguments using the simplest rules of inference. So for a rationalist like me, this is a very problematic methodology. But I respect, alternative approaches. Sure.
Well, Dorobantu was speaking about what is specific about human. And he was questioning that we keep raising the bar in order to say we are different from AI and robots because we are better in some way. We are not. Perhaps what's specific to humans is what in theological terms is told by Psalm 8, little less than angels, but are earthen creatures. I recall Pascal saying that man is neither angel nor brute, and unfortunately, he who would act the angel acts the brute, meaning we are ambiguous as creatures. And nobody would want an ambiguous robot. So what's the point of building a robot like as good as us if this robot would be ambiguous? We would discard it very soon. So that's my point, my answer to Roberto's concern.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to engage with some of the things Selma was talking about. And also I'd like to commend Marius on his comments on the, this blurring of the distinction between the human and the machine. I think that's really at the core of what needs to be considered. But back to Selma. So on the issue of uncomputable functions, two things. One, I'd like to bring to your consideration the issue that current models produce probabilistic outputs. So they don't assert that this is a final the ultimate judgment on something. It's sort of a probabilistic output. So I think that's one of the things to consider, that this willingness to sort of eschew verifiable, formalizable forms of computation. The other thing is that in terms of uncomputable functions as well, I think advocates of AI would want to argue that okay, they would acknowledge these problems of uncomputable functions, but they would also say that computers can do computations which are basically intractable for human beings. So you've got for them, you've got computation intractability. For example, highly recursive functions and stuff like that. So which you can produce an output via a computer, whereas it was sort of beyond the scope of human capability to run through all those computations. So I was wondering what you would say to those, to someone advocating that as sort of another alternative approach to the nature of intelligence or cognition itself, which is sort of this idea of there being an alien space of reasoning, which is accessible to computers and not accessible to human beings. So wondering what you'd say to that.
Well, very briefly on the second issue of tractability, yeah, we have a hierarchy long established in computer science. It could collapse if P equals NP, but we have a hierarchy for difficulty in terms of amount of time, as you know, and space relative to the size of the input, et cetera. And we know the games that AI has thrived at, beaten us at, Go, checkers, chess, they're actually all in the same class. They're all exponential time, EXP time problems. Can we play them as well as those agents? No. Of course, we invented these categories, and we understand them, and we have the theorems that map them out and chart them. So no, we can't. But I don't think that handling morally difficult moral dilemmas, let's say, going back a bit, I don't think that's a matter of complexity. And by the way, these large language models have yet to confront reasoning problems that are high in the polynomial hierarchy. Microsoft has taken great pains to prevent that. So we don't know how they stack up against human prowess, but I would be willing to grant that. You can take your calculator out and it can trounce you if the numbers get high enough, right? But that's mere calculation. And it sounds like you fully admit that once you move above, so the granddaddy of that was the SAT problem. And then the granddaddy, the thing that was the primogenitor of uncomputable problems, is Alonzo Church's result before Turing saying, hey, you can't do this. You being any machine, finite machine. So yeah, so it sounds like three of us agree. Anyway, that might be very relevant. And I don't see a way out of that. That's why I was willing to bet $1 million at AGI 23. I'll bet $1 million right now that I can give a single logic problem that it will fail on, because it doesn't matter whether the output's probabilistic or whatever, it can't be solved by processing. The problem that I have in mind cannot be solved by processing over the data. Statistically, it's impossible. So now it might change in the future, but right now it would be impossible. Anyway, thank you. There's a quick responses here. And I know that Fraser's had his hand up for a while, so.
I completely agree with Selma that people are hopeless at doing reasoning problems, and that's been clear in the psychology research for some while. I think in the UK we learned that from Peter Wassel earlier than Dan Kahneman, but it's been known for some time. So completely agree about that. I also don't think that people's behavior is much guided by formal reasoning. There may be a few exceptional people who are a bit more guided by logical reasoning than others, but in the main, I think human behavior is not much guided by reasoning. That would be the second point. And thirdly, people generally don't understand why they do what they do. I mean, I think people's motivations are pretty opaque to them, and what people say about why they do things is generally completely unreliable. Those are some starting assumptions. Where does that leave us? I think virtue is not a matter of moral reasoning. I mean, I come back to the sort of correlations between different aspects of morality. What people know intellectually about morality has very little correlation with any other aspects of morality. So we need some different way of thinking about this. And I mentioned the traditional concept of educated conscience, which I think is helpful. It's in the right ballpark. Behavior that's guided by instincts that arise on the spur of the moment, but instincts that are shaped by rational reflection. So you don't decide things on the basis of rational considerations. There often isn't time to do that, but you can shape your instincts in the light of rational considerations. I think that's the kind of ballpark we need to be in thinking about how virtue arises.
Related question to that, Fraser. I've been really thinking about, I didn't get a chance to ask all my questions earlier, so I'm going to play moderator's privilege and come back to that. So I applaud you for wanting to look at modeling for virtue, because I personally think, and I'm not a programmer by any means at all, but to me, at least conceptually, it seems much more difficult because the mean for any given person is different. It's individualized. So what's courageous for me is not necessarily courageous for you. And when we're talking about prudent, even what's prudent depends on a number of factors. How I respond to somebody in a conference is going to be very different than how I respond to friends Friday night over drinks, even if we're talking about something very similar. And so I feel that in some ways it must be much more difficult to try and model that than sort of a utilitarian approach or a deontological universal maxim approach. So I was just curious if you have any response to that, or have you found that to be the case in the modeling that you've done?
Okay, I mean, I completely take the point about individual differences. Any psychologist would, and people have I mean, it comes back to the question of whether there is any universal morality that Robert raised in the first paper. I mean, there's obviously cultural variation, but I think there are some commonalities as well, alongside the individual differences. But even where there are individual differences in what virtues are emphasized, I think there are probably common psychological processes in how people arrive at whatever virtues they do. And that's what you would be trying to model in the cognitive architecture, rather than any particular virtues that people are concerned with.
Yeah, actually, I didn't interview much because I will respond to many of you during my presentation, but just Brendan, to give an insight to your questions and to Fraser project on modelizing virtues. Actually, you can, for example, courage. Depending on how you define courage, if you define courage as a distinct behavior from the average people, which imply a certain risk, for example. So you would define some traits of the behavior, and then you find proxies of these traits, and that means you can through that actually, regardless, it's not only individual. You will find for each individual how courageous it is because of those proxy of those traits. So you can, and that's regardless of yeah, it's for any human being, actually, not culture, not nothing. It's just because you can measure that. So you will look to the behavior. So you will not define courageous as a character trait by a virtue, but the behavior that it is. And you infer, of course, you infer that that behavior means being courageous. And here is the big problem, actually. It's that when your proxy reflects exactly the phenomenon you want to capture, like in this case, the virtue of courage. So this is the big deal, you know, because you can find proxies and you can find measures and variables for everything. The big crucial point in modeling, and I try to do modeling for altruism, for example, in workplaces. It is always to find the right proxy for the context, for the phenomenon you want to capture, with all the possible control variables to be sure that, yes, indeed, what you capture, it's exactly what you look for, but you always have oh, this is true for this set of data. So this would be, I would say, I would say this is the minimum you have to be cautious always for the result. Thank you.